At 3:47 in the morning, inside a heavily secured room in Brussels, something happened that could change the balance of global power for decades. No cameras, no press, no announcements, just signatures, quietly placed on a document that, until now, officially did not exist. By the time the sun rose, Europe had taken a step it had avoided for more than 75 years. For the first time since World War II, it began building a defense system without the United States. And almost no one noticed, because events like this don't look dramatic in the moment. They don't come with explosions or headlines. They come with silence and paperwork. But to understand why this matters, you have to understand what came before. For over 7 decades, Europe's security had a backbone: NATO, an alliance built on one simple idea. If one country is attacked, all respond. But behind that idea was something even more important: American power, U.S. nuclear deterrence, U.S. intelligence, U.S. military presence across Europe, tens of thousands of troops, advanced missile systems, surveillance networks. For decades, this system kept the peace. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. And most importantly, it was predictable, until it wasn't. Because the first real crack didn't come from outside Europe. It came from within the alliance itself. During a campaign rally in Phoenix, Donald Trump said something that many initially dismissed as political rhetoric. He questioned whether the United States should automatically defend NATO allies who didn't meet defense spending targets. In simple terms, he questioned Article 5. And that changed everything. Because Article 5 isn't just a policy, it's the foundation of the entire system. Without it, NATO becomes something very different. Not a guarantee, but a possibility. And for European leaders, that possibility was enough. Because for the first time in decades, the question was no longer theoretical. What if the United States doesn't show up? What if the security umbrella disappears overnight? That question triggered something Europe had been discussing quietly for years: strategic autonomy, an idea that once sounded abstract, even unrealistic. But suddenly, it became urgent. Leaders who once debated policy began discussing survival. Emmanuel Macron pushed harder than ever for a Europe that could defend itself. Ursula von der Leyen began shifting the European Union toward real military coordination. And in Eastern Europe, voices became even more direct. Kaja Kallas and other Baltic leaders made it clear: this wasn't about politics, it was about existence. But what truly accelerated everything was timing. Because as these discussions were happening, tensions were rising elsewhere. A speech from Moscow, troop movements near Kaliningrad, signals that could not be ignored. And suddenly, hesitation disappeared. Countries that had resisted deeper military integration began to reconsider. Even the most skeptical governments realized the same thing. Waiting was no longer an option. And that's when the conversations turned into action. The result was something that, until recently, would have seemed impossible. A new framework, quietly negotiated, carefully constructed: the Brussels Security Charter. On paper, it looked like policy, but in reality, it was something much bigger: a shift in power. The agreement outlined joint weapons procurement, prioritizing European defense companies. It committed member states to increase defense spending beyond previous NATO targets. And most importantly, it established a centralized command structure based in Brussels: independent, coordinated, European. It wasn't just cooperation, it was the beginning of a parallel system, one that could operate with or without the United States. And then came the moment. No speeches, no applause, just signatures. 28 nations. One document. A quiet acknowledgement that something fundamental had changed, not with celebration, but with awareness. because everyone in that room understood what it meant. This wasn't just policy, it was a line being drawn. And once that line is crossed, there's no going back. But what happens next may be even more important, because decisions like this don't stay contained, they ripple outward. In Washington, questions immediately began to surface. What happens to the 65,000 American troops stationed across Europe? What happens to decades of military coordination? And more importantly, what happens to influence? In Beijing, analysts were watching closely. Because if the United States appears less committed in Europe, what does that mean for Asia? For Taiwan? For regional alliances? And in Moscow, the shift created something else entirely: opportunity. Because a divided alliance is easier to navigate than a unified one. And this is how global systems change, not through one event, but through a chain reaction, one decision leading to another, until suddenly, the structure that once seemed permanent begins to look fragile. So the real question isn't whether this moment matters, it's how much it matters. Is this a temporary adjustment? A reaction to political uncertainty? Or is this the beginning of something much larger? A new phase in global power? Because history usually moves slowly, over decades, through small changes that are barely noticeable. But sometimes, it accelerates. And when it does, everything changes at once. The only question is whether we recognize it while it's happening.